This is my model railroad layout. It's built in O scale, but it features narrow gauge trains running on HO scale tracks, so actually this is truly an ON30 scale layout. I've had model trains since I was a kid, but switched to different scales and different layouts throughout the years, and this layout is my most recent. So to understand how I got to this point, we must travel back to the first layout I ever built. In 2015, I set out to build the Crater Valley N-Scale Railroad. Yes, the misspelling of the word crater was intentional. I started with a table base I put together measuring 3 by 5 feet and started adding insulation foam on top of that. The foam is meant to make it easier for me to carve landscapes and add foliage. Unfortunately, the only foam I could get my hands on had this aluminum backing to it, and when you remove the aluminum, the foam wants to curl up, so the board had to be fastened down in several areas. I started putting together the shape of the landscape, leaving the track layout as an afterthought, and believe me, I never made that mistake again. I wanted to really test the limits of what my N-scale trains could do, so I made sure to put plenty of varying grade elevations and tight curves. The result was a twisting bird's nest of poorly laid out track that resulted in several derails and inadequate power connection. Not to mention, the trains had difficulty getting up the steep hills. As a kid, I always owned HO scale trains, but the smaller N scale size allowed for putting a bigger landscape within a smaller footprint of space. So I heavily invested in N scale. But there is one huge problem with N scale. It works great for most types of railroading, except if you want to work with steam locomotives from the 1870s and 1880s. Their small size and N scale made for very poor electrical pickup and a very weak pulling power. Although you wouldn't think that's the case. I mean, look at how well these 440 engines are doing. But this was just clever editing. I switched off the camera every time the engine lost power or got stuck. Still, I thought this problem was due to my poor construction method, and that was part of the truth. So I continued with the landscaping of the layout, but in the back of my mind, I was already designing a much better one that didn't push the engines to their limits, and one that offered more realism. At this time, I had an N-scale model of Disneyland's CK Holiday locomotive. This was the most reliable engine on my whole layout, and was my favorite to run. I wanted my train layout to mimic certain aspects of the Disneyland Railroad without directly copying it, which is what explains the reason for my Narragansett-style excursion train. The old Crater Valley Railroad was beginning to bother me. The frequent operation issues I had with it was frustrating, and I got tired of looking at it. I wanted something that looked less like a fire hazard and would impress everyone who saw it. So I began designing the next layout, and when I was ready, I gave this one away. I had no regrets. Even now, I cringe at the sight of my first monstrosity. In early 2017, I began constructing the Hill Creek Hollow Railroad. At a size of 3 feet by 6 feet, it would be slightly larger, and the materials I used for building it would make it incredibly lightweight, yet strong. Once again, foam would go on top. From there, I drew out the landscape and cut it. In order to make the track work neat and tidy, I knew I wanted to have a rail yard where my trains could be neatly stored out of view, and it would have plenty of capacity for all 5 of my trains. I thought the S-curves on the layout looked incredible, but once again, it would lead to future issues. Pay no attention to the pink heart on the wall. That bedroom once belonged to my sister back in high school, and I never painted over the heart after she moved out. I actually came very close to completing this layout. As you can see, it was much more realistic than the last, and it was more pleasing to the eye. The mountains in the background helped hide the rail yard, and the varying terrain was designed to make it look as if the train was weaving through the landscape. But this time, there were no hills for the trains to climb. I even created a locomotive museum for all the engines that no longer worked properly. Some of them were new right out of the box, and they didn't function as I expected. By creating a better electrical system, I was able to supply the power to the rails more efficiently, and therefore the locomotives stalled fewer times along the tracks. I thought I was clever. I thought that by eliminating upward grades, the trains wouldn't have traction issues. But remember that S-curve I mentioned? Well, it provided enough resistance to the train that sometimes the locomotives would just stall as they emerged from the other side of the tunnel. I wanted to run a steam layout that would behave more realistically. Real locomotives don't rely on rubber tires for traction the way N-scale ones do. They used their tonnage to do the heavy hauling. so I started to wonder about ON30. I found a good deal for some ON30 scale train equipment and purchased a small Porter engine. I wanted to see if it got good electrical pickup, despite its small size, and if it was strong, despite not using rubber tires. I also got a passenger car and a caboose. They all had a good size and weight, and had a quality design. My hope was that the larger scale would perform better and allow me to keep my dream of having a model steam railroad without the petty frustration of just getting the darn stuff to work. My Disneyland engine wore out its rubber tires and could no longer even pull its own weight. My N-scale layout was useless and gathering dust. I set up a test track on the floor to see how the little engine behaved, and I was immediately blown away. It had a great electrical pickup, which meant I could run it at slower speeds, and it was strong. I immediately bought a second engine. It was a Forney-style engine, twice the size and weight of the Porter. It took some rewiring to get it to function, but when it did, it completely changed my grim outlook on model railroading. From then on, I knew I was switching to ON30. I needed to test the engine's pulling power to ensure it could haul the amount of cars I wanted it to. Then I needed to test it under tight curves to find its minimum turn radius. The results were very positive. I drew up a larger version of the Hill Creek Hollow layout since I thought that was a good design. With the trains always going clockwise, the 4 right turns would wear out on one side of the train, so having a left turn in there somewhere would help wear the train more evenly. At first, I was inspired by the Thunder Mesa mining layout for the scenery, but decided to do my own thing. Meanwhile, I bought more passenger cars. They're designed to light up, but they only had one little incandescent light, and it wasn't bright enough to even notice when it was on. So I bought new LEDs and installed them myself, this time putting 2 lights per car for a more even light distribution. I was really pleased with the results. The lights would turn on even if there wasn't enough power to move the locomotive. My friend Steve built me a new layout table measuring 4 feet by 8 feet in exchange for giving him my old N-scale layout, so I immediately set up a new temporary track on what I would later call the Tumble Rock Canyon Railroad. It would be the largest layout I've ever built, and designed to last the rest of my life. I started with a 3-inch layer of foam, then drew out a grid. From there I cut out the river gorge and began laying flex track in the designed formation. The trains can't operate without the bridges, so I began designing the bridge bents for the trestle, drawing them out in life size and then cutting the wood pieces I needed. Each piece was cut to dimension, then dyed using a mix of India ink and water to make the lumber look aged. The appearance was realistic for lumber that would suffer wood rot from sitting out in the elements for a while. From there, I glued them to form the bridge bents, although I decided to remake them because I didn't think the first version was realistic enough. The bents were placed around a curve, and the rest of the lumber would be glued to them to form the trestle. This made me very anxious because up until this point, I've never relied on my own engineering skills to support such a large piece of track, holding up rather heavy model trains. I then completed a pony truss bridge using the same design techniques. I must say, I think I did a pretty good job on this one. The third and final span was a simple timber bridge. This allowed me to show my skills at building 3 types of bridge architecture, from simple to complex. I finished linking and soldering the rest of the track, wiring it up for electrical connection by using bus wires underneath the table. The 2 short track pieces that end at the river's edge is going to be the engine house for storing the locomotives. Because this system is entirely analog and not digital, you can't normally operate 2 locomotives independently, so the engine house tracks are isolated on their own circuits, which allows me to operate one locomotive independently from the other. I began installing the bridges, but I couldn't permanently glue them down because I wasn't finished sculpting and shaping the river, so they are only temporarily assembled. Now we can see all the track fully installed, and we can have a bit of fun running the trains for the first time on their trial run around. By flipping on the left switch, I can connect the left engine house track to the main power. When I increase the throttle control, the little Porter engine begins to roll out of the engine house. Yes, I had just gotten everything up and running and was so happy to begin working on the landscape. But then, COVID happened, and it changed everything in my life. I had to pack up and move out of the apartment I spent 11 years in. I ended up moving 1,000 miles up north to Portland, Oregon. This meant stuffing everything I had into a moving truck and driving for 2 days through the coastal wilderness. I don't live in the heart of the city, but actually along the outskirts of the greater Portland area, in a nice place surrounded by small forests and rivers. After nearly 2 years of living with family, I was able to get my own studio apartment just a few months ago, and I finally had the space to set up the train layout, which had been in storage since I first moved up north. My friends had to help me roll the layout down the driveway of the apartment complex. As a result of moving it around twice and rolling it up a couple hundred feet of uneven pavement, the bridges became heavily damaged, rendering them unusable until they could be repaired. The timber bridge lost one of its support piers, and the trestle had several lumber pieces break away and fall off. The whole thing was quite loose, and even the track had separated from the bridge itself. So I went to work repairing everything and gluing the track back down. Heavy cans of garbanzo beans and tomato sauce worked quite well as weights to ensure an even adhesion. Now that the track was done, I needed to assess the damage to the rolling stock. The couplers on the passenger cars were damaged sometime during the move. They must have been pressed against the sides of the box, and so they needed to be replaced, or else they couldn't link together to form a train. Thankfully, O scale is nice and big compared to N scale, so replacing couplers is really a simple and easy task and doesn't require a magnifying glass. Now the passenger cars are repaired and are ready to roll. I flip on the right switch to connect the right side track of the engine house to the main power, and I can begin rolling the Forney locomotive out. As the Forney crosses over the mainline switch, it will come to a stop after it, and once the switch is thrown the other way, the engine can reverse up to the passenger cars and link with the couplers. As you can probably tell by now, there are no sound effects. These are older model trains that were manufactured before the digital craze took over the model railroading hobby. As a result, I was able to buy all this stuff for a slightly cheaper price. Sure, I could convert the whole layout to digital, but it would be expensive and not really necessary since it's such a small layout. There's really no reason to run 2 trains at the same time, considering there also isn't enough room to run 2 simultaneously. It wouldn't make sense to me to go through all that trouble and expense just to hear some sound effects. The Forney makes its way along the riverbanks, passing a spur track to its left. That slight left turn helps add a little wear to the opposite side of the train, since it will basically always be making right turns around the layout. And now the passenger train emerges from the future site of a short tunnel between the rockwork, and starts making its turn over the large trestle bridge. It's a 24-foot drop to the bottom of Tumble Rock Canyon, and this old bridge has seen better days, so nobody make any sudden moves. The Tumble Rock Canyon Railroad will be fictional to a certain degree. While I am going for some accuracy, I'm kind of making up my own world here. The idea is that the railroad is a short-line heritage narrow-gauge railroad passing through a small wilderness ghost town in the Pacific Northwest. The namesake of the railroad is the large canyon carved out by a waterfall, which the old trestle bridge surrounds. In the old days, the railroad was used to transport freight and passengers, using the town as a short whistle stop along the journey. Now it serves much the same purpose, taking tourists on a sightseeing journey through time. This model railroad will take a long time to develop and construct, but it will never be complete. Any model railroader who builds layouts knows you're never quite finished. But I look forward to bringing you all on the journey in future updates to come. Be sure to give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this content, consider supporting my channel by either signing up for my Patreon or to my YouTube memberships. That way you can get exclusive perks in return. Links are in the description below. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.